Have you ever witnessed an injustice so blatant it leaves you speechless? A racist police officer sees a black woman searching through a nice car and assumes that she is trying to steal it, so he arrests her for no reason. Afterwards, the officer is informed that he just arrested a state attorney. Dark Threads brings you this shocking story. Danielle Lawson stood in the middle of the parking lot, beads of sweat forming on her forehead under the hot afternoon sun. The black SUV in front of her was unlocked, the driver's side door opened wide as she bent over the seat, shuffling through papers and stray receipts in a frantic search for her missing purse. Come on, she muttered under her breath, her fingers moving quickly as she rifled through the mess. She had already been running late when she pulled into the lot, but now she was in real trouble. Her phone buzzed for the third time, the screen lighting up with another missed call from her office. She didn't even bother checking it right now, her focus was on finding her purse where her wallet, ID, and everything else important in her life were stashed. The faint hum of an engine caught her attention, and she straightened slightly, glancing up to see a police cruiser slowly pulling through the lot. The officer behind the wheel looked her way, and she quickly turned back to her car, trying not to draw any more attention. She didn't have time for this. Still, she could feel the officer's eyes on her as the cruiser rolled to a stop. The door opened, and heavy boots hit the asphalt. "Hey," a rough voice called out. Danielle froze, fingers still on the edge of the car seat, her heart sank as she straightened up slowly, already anticipating what was coming. She took a deep breath and turned to face the officer. He was a white man, middle-aged, with a hardened face and a scowl that seemed permanent. His uniform was crisp, though he wore his authority with a casual arrogance, his hand resting on his belt, his eyes narrowed as he looked her up and down. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, voice sharp and suspicious. Danielle wiped a bit of sweat from her forehead and took a step back from the car, trying to maintain her composure. "I'm just looking for my purse," she said calmly, keeping her tone even. "I misplaced it somewhere in the car." The officer's scowl deepened. "You got ID on you?" he asked, his hand still resting on his belt as though ready to act at any moment. Danielle blinked, feeling her stomach tighten. "Like I said, I lost my purse," she explained, gesturing toward the car. "That's what I'm looking for. I'm late for a meeting." The officer interrupted, not letting her finish. "Late for a meeting, right. Step away from the vehicle." Danielle bit her tongue. She didn't want this to escalate. Slowly, she stepped away from the car, raising her hand slightly to show she wasn't a threat. "This is my car," she repeated, her voice steady. "I just need to find my purse and I'll be out of here." But the officer wasn't listening, his eyes were locked on her, a mixture of suspicion and something darker flickering in his gaze. He took a step closer, his posture rigid. "Lady, you're acting real suspicious. You expect me to believe you just lost your purse in this car?" He glanced at the SUV as if trying to spot some evidence that she didn't belong there. Danielle felt her patience fray. "Yes, it's my car," she said more firmly this time. "I'm the state attorney. I lost my purse, that's why I'm searching for it." The officer raised an eyebrow, a mocking smile creeping onto his face. "State attorney, huh? You got any proof of that? Because right now, all I see is someone breaking into a car." Danielle's jaw tightened. She didn't need this, not today, not ever, but especially not now. "I told you, my ID is in my purse," she said, trying to keep the frustration out of her voice. The officer took another step forward, his hand now resting on the top of his holster. "Yeah, sure. Just step away from the vehicle now." Danielle opened her mouth to protest but stopped herself. She knew how this looked, a black woman alone in a parking lot rummaging through an SUV without ID. She knew how people like this officer saw her. She also knew that arguing further would only make things worse. With a deep breath, she stepped farther back away from the open door of the car, her mind raced, trying to figure out how to handle this without letting it spiral out of control. She wasn't afraid, but she wasn't naive either. This kind of situation could go south fast. Voice rises with intensity, but wait, could this officer's mistake cost him everything? The officer meanwhile seemed to take her compliance as an admission of guilt. He circled the car, glancing inside before turning his attention back to her. Hands where I can see them, he ordered, pulling out a pair of handcuffs from his belt. Danielle's eyes widened in disbelief. Wait, what? Are you serious? I told you this is my car. But the officer wasn't listening. He stepped forward, grabbing her arm with one hand while snapping the cuffs onto her wrist with the other. Danielle felt a surge of anger and disbelief as the cold metal locked around her wrists. You're under arrest, the officer said, his voice cold, for suspicion of vehicle theft. Danielle couldn't believe it. Her purse was somewhere in that car, but she was the one being treated like a criminal. As he led her toward the patrol car, she cast one last look at her vehicle, feeling a mix of frustration and anger rise in her chest. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Danielle sat in the back of the police car, her wrists still cuffed behind her. The seat was hard and uncomfortable, and the smell of stale coffee hung in the air. She leaned her head back against the headrest, her mind racing. This wasn't how her day was supposed to go. Through the window, she saw Officer Mulligan standing by her SUV, peering inside with his flashlight even though the sun was still blazing overhead. The suspicion in his eyes hadn't lessened, if anything it had grown stronger, fed by the assumptions he had already made about her. Danielle sighed and glanced around the empty parking lot. A couple of people had walked by earlier, staring at her in the back of the police car, but doing nothing, their faces tight with discomfort. No one had stepped in to ask what was happening. The door opened suddenly, and Mulligan appeared, his face set in a grim frown. He pulled her out of the car roughly and turned her to face him. Still no ID, he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. I told you, Danielle said, her voice steady but clipped, my purse is somewhere in my car. If you let me get it, I can show you everything you need. Mulligan shook his head, ignoring her completely. You expect me to believe that you're just some law-abiding citizen who lost her purse? Come on, you're trying to steal that car, it's obvious. Danielle took a deep breath, trying to keep her frustration in check. Look, officer, she said, doing her best to stay calm, I'm the state attorney. That's my car. If you just check the registration or run a background check, you'll see everything's in order. State attorney, Mulligan let out a short, mocking laugh. Lady, you can't be serious. People like you don't get jobs like that. Now stop lying and maybe this will go easier for you. Danielle felt her jaw tighten, the anger bubbling up inside her. People like me, she asked, raising an eyebrow. What exactly do you mean by that? Mulligan ignored the question, leaning in closer with a sneer. What I mean is that you're making this harder than it needs to be. You should have thought of a better story, state attorney. He scoffed. I've heard worse, but that's up there. Danielle stared at him, her patience thinning. She had spent years working her way through law school, fighting against every assumption and barrier people had placed in front of her because of the color of her skin. Now, standing here handcuffed, facing this man who couldn't even bother to listen to her, all of that frustration boiled just beneath the surface. This is ridiculous, Danielle muttered, more to herself than to Mulligan. Oh, it's ridiculous all right, Mulligan said, taking a step back and waving another patrol officer over. You think you can just waltz in here, steal a car, and get away with it because you've got a fancy job title in your head? No way. Danielle shook her head in disbelief. I'm telling you the truth. Why won't you just run the plates? Mulligan shot her an irritated look. Why? So you can buy yourself more time? I know your type. You probably got a record. You think you're smarter than me, but you're not. Danielle had to fight back a retort. She knew better than to argue with someone like Mulligan in this situation. Still, every word out of his mouth felt like a slap in the face. She knew he wasn't interested in the truth, he had already decided who she was the second he saw her. The second officer, a younger man, approached with a clipboard. He glanced at Danielle, then looked back at Mulligan. Everything all right here? The younger officer asked, looking uneasy. Mulligan waved a hand dismissively. Just a routine arrest. She's got some excuse about being the state attorney or whatever. Doesn't have her ID, though, so I'm booking her for attempted vehicle theft. Danielle clenched her fists behind her back, the cold metal of the handcuffs digging into her skin. She couldn't believe this was happening. "You haven't even checked the plates," she said again, her voice firm. Mulligan shot her a glare. "You can stop talking now," he said, his voice low and threatening, "or I'll make sure you regret it." Danielle bit her lip, holding back everything she wanted to say. She knew this wasn't the time to push him further. Instead, she kept quiet as Mulligan and the other officer talked amongst themselves. Every second they wasted felt like an insult, a deliberate choice not to see her as anything but a criminal. After what felt like forever, Mulligan finally spoke. "We'll see what the truth is once we get to the station." Danielle didn't resist. She didn't have the energy to fight this any longer. As the door slammed shut behind her, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm. This wasn't over, not yet. She knew the truth would come out eventually, it had to. But the fact that she was being treated like this in the first place was a reminder of everything she had fought against her whole life. And as she stared out the window, watching the city blur past, she couldn't help but wonder how many others had gone through this exact same thing, people without the power or connection she had, people who had been silenced before they ever had the chance to speak. Danielle knew one thing for sure: when this was over, there would be consequences. Danielle sat in the cold, dimly lit holding cell, her wrists aching from the tight handcuffs. The sounds of the police station echoed around her, officers walking back and forth, phones ringing, and distant chatter that blurred together. She'd been through these kinds of places countless times, but always from the other side. Now she was the one being treated like a criminal, and the absurdity of it all sat heavy in her chest. Her mind replayed the events of the last hour: Officer Mulligan's sneering face, his complete refusal to listen to her, his dismissiveness when she mentioned her position. He hadn't even checked her plates, he hadn't done any background checks. She had been arrested solely on his assumptions, nothing more. She tried to shift in the hard plastic chair she'd been forced into, her hands cuffed behind her. Across the room, Mulligan was filling out paperwork, muttering to another officer who occasionally glanced over at her. There was no urgency in their actions, no recognition of the mistake they were making, just another day at the office for them. "Hey," Danielle called out, trying to get Mulligan's attention. "Can I at least get these cuffs off? You know this is unnecessary." Mulligan didn't even look up. "Yeah, sure, you just sit tight and we'll get to that when we're ready," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Danielle sighed, her frustration mounting. She had dealt with difficult officers before, but none as openly hostile as this. She was a state attorney, for God's sake, how was this happening? She had never expected to be in a position like this, especially not for simply looking through her own car. But here she was. After what felt like an eternity, Mulligan finally walked over to her. He leaned down, placing his hands on the table in front of her, his expression still smug. "All right, state attorney," he said, his tone mocking, "you ready to come clean yet?" Danielle looked him dead in the eye. "I've told you the truth from the beginning. I'm the state attorney for this city, and you've made a huge mistake. But you're too wrapped up in your own bias to realize that." Mulligan chuckled. "Bias, lady? This isn't about bias, this is about you not having any proof, acting all suspicious and giving me a bunch of excuses. You know how many times I've heard people say they've lost their ID? Happens all the time. You're not special." Danielle took a deep breath, steadying herself. "If you just run a background check or check the plates, you'd know everything you need to. This could have been over by now." Mulligan straightened up, shaking his head. "Background check? Plates? Nah, you don't get to tell me how to do my job. You criminals always think you know better. You're lucky I haven't booked you for resisting." Danielle's hands tensed in the cuffs, but she didn't rise to his bait. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she said, her voice low but firm. "When this is over, you're going to regret how you handled this." Mulligan raised an eyebrow, but the smirk never left his face. "Is that so? What, you think you're going to scare me, lady? I've been doing this job for 20 years. I've seen it all, and trust me, whatever little power trip you're on isn't going to work here." Danielle didn't respond. She was done arguing with him. There was no point. She just needed to get out of here and let the truth handle itself. Another officer, the younger one from earlier, walked over and handed Mulligan a clipboard. He glanced at it, then handed it back without even bothering to read what was written. "What about her call?" the younger officer asked, looking somewhat uncomfortable with the situation. "Shouldn't she be allowed to make one by now?" Mulligan waved him off dismissively. "She gets her call when I say she gets her call," he muttered, turning his back on both of them. "Besides, what's she going to do, call the mayor?" He laughed at his own joke. Danielle's frustration turned into a quiet, simmering anger. She knew the procedure, and she knew this was wrong. But more than that, she knew that Mulligan didn't care. This wasn't about justice for him, it was about control, and right now he was enjoying every second of it. A moment later, another officer, an older man with a tired expression, walked in. He glanced around the room, his eyes landing on Danielle for a brief second. Something flickered in his gaze, recognition perhaps, but he quickly masked it and turned to Mulligan. "Mulligan, what's going on with her?" the officer asked, his voice gruff but curious. Mulligan turned to face him, still relaxed, still confident. "Just another case of someone thinking they're above the law. Says she's the state attorney. Can you believe that?" The older officer raised an eyebrow. "State attorney, huh?" he said slowly, glancing at Danielle again. Danielle met his gaze evenly. "That's exactly who I am. If you'd like to check, I'm sure you'll find everything in order." The older officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gave Mulligan a long, appraising look. "Might be a good idea to run those plates," he said, his tone more neutral now. Mulligan snorted. "I'll get around to it," he said, waving his hand as if it didn't matter. Danielle locked eyes with the older officer, hoping he would be the one to do something. But after a beat, he just turned and walked back to his desk, leaving her in the same position she'd been in for hours, still handcuffed, still disbelieved, still stuck. She let out a slow breath, staring at the floor. She needed that phone call. She needed someone to come down here and set this straight, because clearly no one was going to help her unless she forced the issue. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mulligan strolled back over, his grin as wide as ever. All right, princess, you want your phone call? You got it. Let's see what kind of favors you can call in." Danielle didn't respond. She just stood up as he uncuffed her, flexing her sore wrists, and walked over to the phone, her mind already focused on who she needed to call. This wasn't over, not yet. Danielle rubbed her wrists, trying to get feeling back into them after the hours she'd spent cuffed. The phone was a few steps away, sitting on a small metal desk in the corner of the room. It was an old landline, the kind she rarely used anymore, but right now it was her lifeline. She walked over, her back straight, her movements calm despite the anger swirling inside her. Mulligan leaned against the wall near the door, watching her with that same smug smile on his face, arms crossed as if he thought this whole situation was amusing. "Make it quick," he said. "Wouldn't want you wasting any more of our time." Danielle ignored him. She picked up the receiver and dialed the number she knew by heart. It rang once, twice, then a familiar voice answered. Mark Edwards. "Mark, it's Danielle," she said, her voice calm but firm. There was a pause on the other end. She could almost hear him straightening up in his chair. "Danielle, where are you? I've been trying to reach you." "I'm at the police station," she said, keeping her voice even, though it was hard to keep the frustration out of it. "I was arrested." "Arrested?" Mark's voice was sharp with disbelief. "For what?" She glanced at Mulligan, who was still watching her with that same lazy smirk. "They think I was trying to steal my own car," she said dryly. There was a brief silence, and then Mark sighed. "Which station are you at?" "Central Precinct," Danielle replied, her eyes locked on Mulligan. "And I need you down here as soon as possible." "I'm on my way," Mark said quickly. "Don't say anything else. I'll handle it." Danielle hung up the phone, her fingers tight around the receiver for a moment before she placed it back down gently. She turned to face Mulligan, who raised an eyebrow at her. "So, who's coming to save you?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Danielle's lips tightened into a thin line. Yes, she said simply, her voice steady. Mulligan pushed himself off the wall and took a step toward her, his eyes narrowing. You know, you've got a real attitude for someone in your position. Most people would be grateful to get a phone call, but you think you're special, don't you? Danielle looked him dead in the eye, her expression unreadable. I don't think I'm special, she said, but I do think you're making a mistake. Mulligan chuckled, shaking his head. Sure. I'll believe that when I see it. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Danielle standing alone. She took a deep breath, then sat down in the chair, trying to calm herself. This was far from over, but knowing Mark was on his way gave her some relief. He wasn't just a lawyer, he was one of the best, and they had worked together on many cases. He knew how to handle situations like this, and she trusted him completely. Still, the fact that it had come to this at all was infuriating. She looked around the small, drab room, the walls painted an unpleasant shade of gray and the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over everything. It was a room designed to make people feel small, powerless, but Danielle refused to let it affect her. She had spent too long fighting for justice in rooms like this to be broken by one arrogant officer's assumptions. Time passed slowly, each minute dragging as she sat there waiting. The door opened occasionally as other officers passed by, glancing at her with mild curiosity but saying nothing. No one bothered to check her background or confirm her identity. It was as if they were content to let her sit there indefinitely, another nameless, faceless person caught in the system. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door swung open and Mark Edwards walked in. His tall, lean frame filled the doorway, his sharp gray suit in stark contrast to the dingy surroundings. He looked around the room, his expression tight with controlled anger before his eyes landed on Danielle. Danielle, he said, his voice low but calm. Are you all right? Danielle nodded, standing up from the chair. I'm fine, but we need to deal with this now. Mark turned to the officer who had followed him in. I want to speak to whoever's in charge here immediately. The officer, younger than Mulligan, shifted uncomfortably and looked toward the hallway. I'll get someone, he mumbled before disappearing quickly. Mark turned back to Danielle, his expression hard. Unbelievable. They didn't even check your ID? No, Danielle said, her voice tight. They arrested me without doing any kind of background check, just took me in based on Mulligan's assumptions. Mark clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. This is completely unacceptable. Don't say anything else. I'll take care of it. They didn't have to wait long. Officer Mulligan re-entered the room, his cocky demeanor slipping just slightly when he saw Mark standing next to Danielle. He paused in the doorway, sizing Mark up. You must be the lawyer, Mulligan said, his tone still flippant, though there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice now. That's right, Mark said smoothly. And I'm here to inform you that you've made a grave mistake. You arrested the state attorney without cause, failed to perform even basic checks, and violated her rights. I'm here to see that this is rectified immediately. Mulligan's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. State attorney, huh? That's the story she's been sticking to. Mark took a step forward, his eyes cold. It's not a story, it's a fact. And if you don't take this seriously, you'll be dealing with a lawsuit so fast your head will spin. Mulligan's face darkened. You're telling me she's really— Yes, Mark interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. She's the state attorney, and you've made a monumental error. For the first time since this all started, Danielle saw the doubt creeping into Mulligan's expression. He shifted on his feet, glancing between her and Mark, clearly unsure of what to do next. Well, maybe if she'd told me that sooner, Mulligan began, but Mark wasn't having it. She did, Mark snapped. And you didn't listen. Now you're going to fix this, or I'm going straight to the police chief. Mulligan's bravado was slipping fast. He stood there frozen for a moment, then muttered something under his breath before turning and storming out of the room. Danielle watched him go, her anger simmering beneath the surface. She turned to Mark, her expression grateful but still tense. Thank you, she said quietly. Mark nodded, his face softening slightly. This isn't over yet. Let's make sure they release you properly, and then we'll deal with the rest. Danielle sat in the interrogation room, her hands resting on the metal table. The room felt colder now, the sterile atmosphere pressing down on her, but her frustration had begun to fade. She knew Mark was handling things, and soon this entire situation would unravel. The door swung open with a creak, and Officer Mulligan entered, his usual swagger slightly diminished. He didn't meet Danielle's eyes right away as he walked to the corner of the room, leaning against the wall with crossed arms. His smirk wasn't quite as sure as before, though he was clearly trying to hold on to it. A few moments later, Mark entered, followed closely by the police sergeant in charge of the precinct, a tall, broad man with graying hair and a tired expression. The sergeant walked in with a sense of authority, his eyes immediately scanning the room. He had the look of someone who'd seen too many situations like this and was already aware something had gone very wrong. Danielle straightened up as the sergeant glanced at her, then at Mark. He cleared his throat and addressed the room, his voice firm. "All right, let's get to the bottom of this," he said. "I've been informed there's been a serious misunderstanding. Miss Lawson, you've been detained under the suspicion of vehicle theft, is that correct?" "Yes," Danielle said, her voice calm and controlled, "but I've explained multiple times that I'm the state attorney for the city and this is my vehicle." "Officer Mulligan refused to check my ID or verify any of my information." The sergeant turned to Mulligan, his expression hardening. "Mulligan, is that true? You didn't check her ID?" Mulligan shifted uncomfortably but maintained his defensive posture. "She said she didn't have her ID. She lost her purse. I followed protocol based on the situation." Mark stepped forward, his voice steady and authoritative. "You didn't follow protocol, Officer Mulligan. You failed to run her plates, you failed to perform any sort of background check, you ignored every piece of information she provided, including the fact that she's the state attorney. Instead, you profiled her and escalated a situation that didn't need escalation." Mulligan clenched his jaw, his face reddening. "She didn't have proof on her. I can't just take people at their word. We deal with liars all the time." The sergeant held up a hand to silence Mulligan, his expression stern. "That's enough. The issue isn't whether she had ID on her at the time, it's how you handled this from the start. Did you or did you not verify her identity through any other means?" Mulligan looked away, clearly uncomfortable. "No," he muttered. Danielle watched the exchange, her frustration simmering under her calm exterior. She had tried to reason with Mulligan, had given him every chance to check her information, but he hadn't cared. Now he was finally being called out for it. Mark took another step forward, his voice rising slightly. "And when I arrived, you still refused to acknowledge who she was. You continued to mock her and dismissed my explanation outright. You're not just negligent, Officer Mulligan, you're reckless." The sergeant's eyes narrowed at Mulligan, who was now standing with his arms crossed, his face hardening in defense. "You need to learn how to handle these situations properly," the sergeant said. "This isn't about catching people in lies, it's about doing your job thoroughly. You didn't do that, and now we've detained the state attorney under false charges." Mulligan scowled, but there was no denying the shift in the room. He was no longer in control, and everyone knew it. "I was doing my job," he muttered, his voice quieter now. Danielle finally spoke up, her voice cold and measured. "No, you weren't. You were abusing your power. You saw me and made a judgment without any evidence. You ignored everything I said because you didn't believe someone like me could hold a position like mine." Mulligan's eyes snapped to hers, anger flickering across his face, but he stayed quiet. The sergeant sighed and turned back to Danielle. "Miss Lawson, on behalf of this department, I apologize for the way this was handled. We will release you immediately, and this will be thoroughly reviewed." Danielle's eyes stayed on Mulligan as she spoke, her voice unwavering. "I appreciate that, but this isn't over. There will be consequences, not just for me, but for every person who has been treated this way and hasn't had the power to fight back." The room went silent for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The sergeant nodded solemnly. "Understood. I'll see to it personally that this is addressed." Mark placed a reassuring hand on Danielle's shoulder, and she stood up from the chair, ready to leave the room. But as she walked toward the door, she turned one last time to face Mulligan. "You should have listened when I told you who I was," she said quietly but firmly. "Next time, maybe you'll think twice before you judge someone based on nothing but your own assumptions." Mulligan didn't respond, but his jaw tightened, his fists clenched at his sides. It was clear he was still unwilling to accept the reality of what had just happened, even as the truth stared him in the face. Danielle walked out of the room with Mark by her side, feeling the cold satisfaction of knowing that justice, for now, was in her hands. But she also knew this was only the beginning. There were larger battles to fight, and this was just the start. The next morning, Danielle found herself back at the police station, walking into the familiar building with an air of determination. Today was different. She wasn't here as a suspect or a victim, she was here as the state attorney, ready to ensure that Officer Mulligan faced the consequences of his actions. The events of the previous day still weighed heavily on her, but she had pushed them aside, focusing on what needed to be done next. As she stepped into the meeting room, she saw Chief David Hernandez waiting at the head of the table. He was a tall, stoic man with a serious expression, his salt and pepper hair slicked back. Officer Mulligan was seated to the side, his posture tense. He looked up when she entered, his face betraying a flicker of discomfort, but he quickly masked it with the same hardened expression he had worn the day before. This time, though, it wasn't backed by the same confidence. Danielle nodded curtly at Chief Hernandez, then sat down across from Mulligan. The tension in the room was thick, but Danielle was calm, collected. She knew what needed to be said, and she wasn't going to let Mulligan off the hook. Chief Hernandez cleared his throat and began speaking, his voice even but with a tinge of weariness. "Miss Lawson, I want to first offer a formal apology on behalf of the department for what occurred yesterday. I've reviewed the situation, and it's clear that proper procedure wasn't followed. I assure you this will be dealt with seriously." Danielle met his gaze, her face unreadable. "I appreciate the apology, Chief," she said, her tone controlled, "but apologies don't change what happened. Your officer racially profiled me, refused to verify my identity, and escalated the situation unnecessarily." Mulligan shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. He stared straight ahead, not meeting Danielle's eyes, but the discomfort in his posture was evident. Chief Hernandez glanced at Mulligan before continuing. "I understand, and I agree that Officer Mulligan's actions were unacceptable," Hernandez said. "That's why we're placing him on leave without pay pending a full investigation." Danielle nodded slowly, but her eyes remained fixed on Mulligan. "That's a start, but this isn't just about me. It's about how many people like me get treated the same way and don't have the power to defend themselves. How many people have been in this exact situation but didn't have someone like Mark Edwards to call or a title like mine to pull them out?" Mulligan shifted again, his discomfort growing more apparent. He finally spoke, his voice low and defensive. "Look, I didn't know who you were, okay? If I'd known, things would have gone differently." Danielle raised an eyebrow, her voice sharp. "That's the problem, Officer Mulligan. You shouldn't treat people differently based on who they are. You should have followed procedure regardless of my position, but you didn't. You saw a black woman rummaging through a car and you assumed the worst." Mulligan opened his mouth to speak but closed it again, clearly struggling to come up with a response. His usual bravado was nowhere to be found, replaced by a simmering frustration that he couldn't express in front of his superior. Chief Hernandez stepped in, his tone firm. "Officer Mulligan, you were in the wrong, and this investigation will determine the consequences of your actions. You need to understand the gravity of this situation." Mulligan clenched his fists on the table, then spoke, his words clipped and defensive. "I made a judgment call based on what I saw." "I didn't mean to," Danielle interrupted, her voice cutting through his words. "To racially profile me, to ignore every piece of information I gave you, to refuse to even check my plates? You didn't make a judgment call, you acted on your own biases." Mulligan's face flushed with anger, but he swallowed his words, knowing he couldn't argue his way out of this. Danielle continued, her tone steady but laced with authority. "This isn't about you not knowing, it's about how you handled the situation from the very beginning. And frankly, your apology isn't about what you did wrong, it's about trying to protect yourself now that you know who I am." Mulligan's eyes flicked to the floor, his mouth set in a hard line. He looked ready to defend himself again, but Chief Hernandez spoke before he could. "Miss Lawson is right," Hernandez said, his voice firm. "This department has no place for actions like yours. This isn't just a one-time mistake, this is a systemic problem, and it needs to be addressed." Danielle nodded slightly, acknowledging the chief's words, but her focus remained on Mulligan. "You should be sorry for what you did," she said, her voice cold, "not just because you did it to me." Mulligan glanced at her, his face tight with barely controlled frustration. "I wasn't trying to," Danielle interrupted again, not allowing him to finish. "I'm not interested in excuses. What you did was wrong, and now you're going to face the consequences." Chief Hernandez spoke again, his tone more measured now. "Officer Mulligan, you'll be placed on leave effective immediately. A full investigation will follow, and we'll be conducting mandatory training for all officers to address these issues." Danielle stood up, her eyes still locked on Mulligan. "I'll be back when the investigation is over," she said calmly. "And if it turns out that this kind of behavior is part of a larger pattern, believe me, there will be more than just training." Mulligan didn't respond this time. He just stared down at the table, his fists clenched tightly. As Danielle turned to leave, Chief Hernandez stood up and walked her to the door. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention, Miss Lawson," he said. "I assure you this won't be taken lightly." Danielle nodded once. "I hope so, Chief. I really do." With that, she walked out of the room, her head held high. This wasn't over yet, but the first step had been taken. Mulligan would face consequences, and the department would be forced to reckon with its failures. But Danielle knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. As she left the station, the weight of the previous day still lingered, but it was lighter now. She had stood her ground, and the truth had been laid bare. Now she would make sure that this kind of injustice didn't go unchecked again. There was a long road ahead, but Danielle Lawson was ready to walk it. The next day, Danielle walked back into the police station with the same sense of purpose as before. This time, however, she wasn't alone. Mark Edwards, dressed in his usual crisp gray suit, walked beside her, his presence a quiet but powerful reminder of the support she had. Today's meeting was with Chief Hernandez and Mulligan again, but the air was heavier. The investigation had moved quickly, and the stakes were higher now. As they approached the chief's office, Danielle felt the tension settle around her shoulders, but it didn't shake her resolve. She knocked once before pushing the door open. Inside, Chief Hernandez sat behind his desk, his expression serious but unreadable. Officer Mulligan was seated in the corner, looking more deflated than before, his confidence drained by the growing consequences of his actions. Danielle and Mark took their seats across from the chief, their expressions equally composed. Chief Hernandez nodded to them both before speaking. "Lawson, Mr. Edwards," he began, folding his hands in front of him, "we've completed our preliminary investigation into the incident, and we've come to a decision. Officer Mulligan's actions were not only out of line but directly violated department procedures. We've decided to terminate his employment effective immediately." Mulligan's face stiffened, his hands gripping the arms of his chair, his lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't speak. There was nothing left for him to say. Danielle glanced at Mulligan, but her focus remained on the chief. "I appreciate that the department took this seriously," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Officer Mulligan's termination, while necessary, isn't enough to address the bigger issue." Chief Hernandez nodded slowly. "I agree. That's why we're initiating a department-wide review of our training practices, particularly concerning racial profiling and escalation protocols. This won't be just a check-the-box exercise. We'll be working with external consultants to ensure that every officer in this department understands the gravity of situations like this one." Danielle leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp. "That's a start, Chief, but I want to be clear, this is about more than training. This is about changing the culture of how your officers approach situations like mine. It's about ensuring that people of color aren't automatically seen as criminals or suspects just because they don't fit a certain image. I want to see real changes, not just on paper, but in the way your officers interact with the people in this community." Chief Hernandez met her gaze, his expression serious. I understand, Miss Lawson, and I can assure you we're committed to making those changes. This incident has highlighted some deep issues within the department, and we won't let it go unaddressed. Danielle studied him for a moment, trying to gauge his sincerity. There had been plenty of promises made in rooms like this before, but follow-through was what mattered. She wasn't looking for more empty words, she was looking for action. Mark cleared his throat, breaking the brief silence. We'll be keeping a close eye on the department's progress, he said smoothly. And if we find that the necessary changes aren't being implemented, we'll be back to ensure that accountability is enforced. Hernandez nodded again, his expression grim. I understand. I'll make sure you're kept updated on our progress. Danielle turned her attention to Mulligan, who sat stiffly, his gaze fixed on the floor. She wasn't looking for an apology from him, she knew she wouldn't get one, at least not one that meant anything, but she wasn't going to let him off the hook without making her point clear. Mulligan, she said, her voice steady, you had a choice that day. You could have done your job properly, listened to me, and checked the facts. Instead, you chose to act on your own prejudices. You assumed I was guilty because of how I looked, and you escalated the situation because you believed you had the power to do so. Now you're facing the consequences of that choice. Mulligan finally looked up, his face pale and drawn. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. He simply stared at her, resentment flickering in his eyes. Danielle didn't need his response. She had said what she needed to say, and the weight of her words hung in the air between them. Chief Hernandez cleared his throat, breaking the tension. Officer Mulligan, you are dismissed. You can collect your things before leaving the premises. Mulligan stood up slowly, his body tense, and walked out of the office without another word. As the door clicked shut behind him, the room seemed to exhale, the oppressive tension easing slightly. But for Danielle, the weight of the situation remained. She turned back to the chief. I'll be following this closely, Chief Hernandez, she said. I'm glad to see the department taking action, but I'll be watching to make sure this isn't just a temporary fix. There's a long way to go. Chief Hernandez gave her a solemn nod, his face lined with the weight of his responsibility. We'll do everything we can to make sure this doesn't happen again. I give you my word. Danielle didn't respond. Words were only the beginning. As she and Mark walked out of the station, the sun was just beginning to rise over the city, casting long shadows on the streets ahead. She knew this was a victory, but it was just one step in a much larger fight. There was still so much work to do, so many more battles to face, but for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Officer Mulligan was gone, and the system that had protected him was finally being forced to reckon with itself. It wasn't enough, but it was a start, and for Danielle Lawson, that was something worth fighting for. Dark Threads concludes this gripping tale, but the fight for justice continues. A week had passed since Officer Mulligan's termination, but the events still weighed heavily on Danielle's mind. She sat in her office, staring out at the busy streets below, the noise of the city barely registering. The battle against one officer's blatant misconduct was over, but it hadn't left her feeling victorious. The system that allowed Mulligan to operate unchecked was still very much intact, and Danielle knew she couldn't rest until real change was in motion. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Chief Hernandez. She picked up the phone, her voice calm as if bracing herself for whatever was next. Danielle Lawson. Miss Lawson, it's Chief Hernandez, he said, his tone formal but more relaxed than before. I wanted to update you on the internal reforms we've started. The department has begun implementing the new training protocols. The consultants are working with us to ensure racial profiling and escalation training is thorough, and I'd like to offer you a seat on the oversight committee to make sure we're staying on track. Danielle leaned back in her chair, processing his words. I appreciate the offer, Chief. It's a step in the right direction, but I hope this isn't just about making things look good on paper. Hernandez paused briefly before responding. I assure you, Miss Lawson, this is about more than appearances. We're committed to making real changes, and your insight would be valuable to the process. Danielle considered his words carefully. I'll think about it, she said. I'm not interested in being part of a show. If I join this committee, it's to make sure the work actually gets done, and that it's done right. Understood, Chief Hernandez replied. We'll welcome your participation whenever you're ready. And again, I'm sorry for what happened. It's clear there's a lot of work to be done. Danielle ended the call and placed the phone back on her desk. Chief Hernandez's efforts seemed sincere, but she couldn't shake the lingering skepticism that had grown over the years. She had seen too many promises of reform that led nowhere, too many press conferences, too many public apologies followed by silence. She rose from her chair and began to pace slowly by the window, the weight of responsibility heavy on her shoulders. Mulligan's firing had been a necessary step, but it was just one officer in a system that had been failing people like her for years. She thought about the countless others who had faced the same injustices but without the power or position to fight back. Her thoughts shifted to the community meetings she had already started organizing. They were small for now, but word was spreading, and more people were beginning to come forward with their own stories of mistreatment. It was clear that Mulligan wasn't an isolated case, he was a symptom of something much larger, and that was where the real battle lay. A knock on her office door pulled her from her thoughts. Mark Edwards walked in, his face calm but knowing. He didn't need to ask how she was feeling, he already knew. Got your message, he said, taking a seat across from her desk. How are things? Danielle sat back down, letting out a slow breath. Chief Hernandez called. They've started the reforms, and he wants me on the oversight committee. Mark raised an eyebrow. And are you considering it? I don't know, she admitted. Part of me wants to be involved, to make sure they're not just checking boxes, but another part of me is tired of hearing the same promises, tired of fighting the same fight. Mark leaned forward slightly. You've always known this wouldn't be easy, but you're in a unique position, Danielle. You can hold them accountable in a way that few others can. Danielle sighed, looking out the window again. I know. It's just, I want this to be real, Mark. I don't want to be part of something that's all talk and no action. I want real change. Mark nodded, his voice soft but firm. Then make it real. Be the one who keeps pushing, who keeps asking the hard questions. You've already started to make a difference, but this is just the beginning. Danielle was quiet for a moment, thinking about the meetings, the stories she'd heard from people in the community, people who had been silenced for too long. I've been organizing community forums, she said. People are starting to come forward. I'm hearing stories that echo what I went through, but most of them don't have the platform I do. If I take this seat on the committee, I want to bring those voices with me. It's the only way I can make sure this isn't just about me. Mark smiled faintly. Then do it. If anyone can bring those voices to the table, it's you. Danielle nodded, a sense of clarity settling in. She couldn't let the exhaustion win. There were too many people depending on her, even if they didn't know it yet. The fight was bigger than just one officer, one incident. It was about dismantling the biases and systems that had been allowed to fester for far too long. She picked up her phone and began typing a message to Chief Hernandez. I'll take the seat on the committee, but understand this, I'm bringing the community with me, and we're not here for half measures. As she hit send, a sense of purpose filled her. The road ahead would be long, but she had never been one to shy away from hard work. Mark stood up, sensing the shift in her energy. You're doing the right thing, Danielle, and I'll be right there with you every step of the way. She looked up at him, grateful for his support. Thanks, Mark. I'll need all the help I can get. After Mark left, Danielle stayed at her desk, but this time her focus was sharp. The small victories of the past week were important, but they were just the foundation for the larger work ahead. The system wouldn't change overnight, but brick by brick, case by case, she was determined to tear down the walls that had kept so many people trapped for so long. Danielle leaned back in her chair and let her mind settle on the work still to come. She had taken the first step, and there was no turning back now. The fight for justice, for true accountability, was far from over, but Danielle Lawson was ready. As the day turned into evening, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that progress was in motion allowed her to breathe a little easier. She had taken on the system, And now she was part of the force that would change it. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like justice wasn't just an ideal, it was within reach. Dark Threads concludes this powerful story of resilience and reform.